This is a video tutorial for Module 1 of Phil 123, Introduction to Western Philosophy. The topic for this particular module is the topic of the concept of validity. I want to spend a little bit of extra time talking about this particular concept because experience indicates that if there's one concept from logic that students have a really difficult time grasping, it's the concept of validity. In the most general terms, what are we saying? What are we talking about when we're talking about validity? Validity is a concept that applies to arguments. Okay, it's not propositions that are valid, it's not sentences that are valid, it's arguments that are valid. In the broadest possible terms, to say that an argument is valid is to say that it's a good argument. Saying that an argument is valid is to say that there's good things about it. That's not to say the best things about it. We'll come back to that point in a minute. But generally, to say that an argument is valid is to say that it's a good argument. Now, there's several things that need to be the case for an argument to be valid. The first thing is that an argument has to be deductive. This is a topic that should be covered in the logic tutorial that's available on the Cengage site. So I'll leave them to explain that much. But if an argument's not deductive, if it's an inductive argument, then the concept of validity simply doesn't apply. The second thing, and this is the tricky part, that we're saying about an argument when we're saying that it's valid. Put it like this. We are saying that if the premises of that argument are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. That's the defining feature of a valid argument, and that's what makes valid arguments good arguments. Okay? To put it more simply, we could say that a valid argument is truth-preserving. But let me say it the more complicated way a couple more times and in a couple different ways. Again, to say that an argument is valid is to say that if its premises are true, the conclusion must be true. To put it another way, to say that an argument is valid is to say that it is impossible for the premises to be false if the conclusion is true. To put it yet another way, if you have a valid argument, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. I like to say that valid arguments are truth-preserving. Okay? If you put true premises into them, it preserves the truth all the way throughout, and you get a true conclusion as the output of your argument. Now, one thing we want to be careful with here, okay, is we don't want to overstate just how good valid arguments are. Good arguments, valid arguments, are truth-preserving. If you put true premises into them, you'll get true conclusions out. Okay? But it is possible for a valid argument to have false premises. It's possible for a valid argument to have a false conclusion. It's possible for a valid argument to have false premises and a false conclusion. Okay? Garbage in, garbage out. If you don't put true premises into a valid argument, you might not get a true conclusion. To see some examples of this, take a look at that first handout. Now, there's any number of examples of arguments there. Valid argument forms. Any argument that has one of those particular forms is itself going to be valid, no matter what the premises are, no matter what the conclusion asserts. So, for example, under the heading of modus ponens and modus tollens, you'll find arguments that assert that it is raining out, that it's not raining out. Well, maybe it is and maybe it's not. What matters and what makes those particular arguments valid is not what the particular premises or conclusion asserts. It has to do with the form of that argument. Any argument that has that particular logical form will be valid. Okay. But take a look at a couple other examples. So for example, under the heading of, and I'm pulling this up on my own computer, under the heading of the categorical syllogism, this is another valid argument form. Any argument that has that form is going to be valid. It's going to be a truth-preserving argument. But take a look at the premises of that first instance. All vegetarians are carnivores. All carnivores eat meat. Therefore, all vegetarians eat meat. Something should strike you as odd about that argument. What should strike you most obviously as odd is that it's got a false premise. All vegetarians are carnivores. In fact, no vegetarians are carnivores. Vegetarians don't eat meat and carnivores do. So that first premise is false. For the same reason, its conclusion, all vegetarians eat meat, is also false. None of them do. So this is an example of a valid argument that has a false premise, has a true one as well, but it has a false premise and a false conclusion. Nonetheless, it's valid. If those premises were true, they're not, but if they were true, that conclusion would have to be true as well. Okay. So That's one thing we want to say about validity, the most basic definition. Again, an argument is valid just in case, it's deductive, and the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. It's valid just so long as it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. A couple other things to say about validity, okay? Because we'll be seeing many examples of valid arguments throughout the semester, and some of them will have conclusions that you agree with, some of them will have conclusions that you do not want to agree with, and some will have conclusions where you're not sure what you think, and that's fine. But again, given what we know about validity, okay, if you come across a valid argument, and that argument has all true premises, we have a special name for arguments like that. We call those arguments sound. Okay? A sound argument is just a valid argument that has all true premises. The important thing about a sound argument is that its conclusion must be true. It has to be true. Whatever else is going on in the sound argument, the conclusion has got to be true. And that just follows from our definition. Again, in a valid argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And we're saying that in a sound argument, it's valid plus true premises. Now, if you want to reject the conclusion of an argument and you know that it's valid, here's what you're going to have to do. You can't just say that the conclusion is false. You can't just assert your own disagreement. That's the whole point of constructing an argument, is to prove that some conclusion is true. If your opponent runs an argument that yields a conclusion you disagree with, and if you know the argument's valid, what you have to do is reject at least one of the premises. If you remember anything about the concept of validity from this lecture, remember this. If you're dealing with a valid argument and you want to reject the conclusion, you have to reject at least one of the premises. That's just the consequences of an argument being valid.